A rancid odor clung to the halls of Changling Palace, mingling with the distant echo of hurried footsteps and the soft crackle of torches. Somewhere deeper within, a faint cry, half gasp, half whimper, pierced the oppressive silence, as though the gilded walls themselves recoiled at the sight of human suffering. Court officials paused in their duties, faces paling when they recognized the frail shape of Concubine Ai Ci, being borne on a litter, her once velvet robes stained and disheveled. Whispers spread like wildfire Lü Taihu's vengeance had begun. The empire held its breath, for no one doubted that to cross the Empress Dowager was to face horrors unspoken. Ai Ci had been more than just a favored consort. She had been the subtle hand guiding Emperor Han Gaozu's empathy toward the suffering masses. In the luminous glow of silk lanterns, her laughter had danced freely, and her ink-black hair had fallen in soft waves that whispered secrets of kindness and counsel. She had listened to state petitions, offered silent solace to the grieving, and carried hope where fear festered. Yet with Han Gaozu's passing, a sudden silence fell over the court, one that Lü Taihu filled with cold ambition. The widow who once mourned beside her husband now ruled as Empress Dowager, her heart hardened by loss. Her grief curdled into suspicion. Any bond the late emperor shared with another woman became a stain upon her own claim to power. Thus, Ai Ci, whose influence had once smoothed the jagged edges of imperial policy, became a symbol of a bygone era Lü Taihu was determined to erase. The corridors that once echoed with Ai Ci's gentle footsteps now trembled under the weight of her fate. Her beauty, once a source of imperial benevolence, was recast as evidence of illicit intimacy. Rumors swirled that Ai Ci had orchestrated hidden alliances, that she had leanings toward factions long disfavored by the new regent. Whether true or born of fear, these whispers were enough in the Empress Dowager's court. A single decree inked with Lü Taihu's seal was all it took to condemn Ai Ci unilaterally, to strip her of status and expose her to punishments reserved for traitors rather than members of the imperial household. On a moonless night, Ai Ci was dragged from her chamber. The doors closed behind her with a terrible finality. Outside the courtyard was empty, but for the hissing breaths of loyal guards. They bore witness to the hush that fell over even the night winds. Ai Ci's face, once radiant with youthful hope, was now drawn and hollow, her eyes reflecting a sorrow that flickered between despair and defiance. Those who dared to meet her gaze saw not a broken woman, but a soul bracing against an abyss. Even before her formal accusation, the air had grown thick with dread. The courtiers recalled how Lü Taihu had ordered architects to design torture devices as grotesque as living nightmares, coils of iron that would twist a body, cages that suffocated slowly, and pits dug beneath palaces where screams would echo interminably. These rumors circulated like a plague, eroding any hope for mercy. In this court, power was measured in fear, and Lü Taihu excelled. The moment Ai Ci appeared in public was the moment her fate was sealed. As a consort of the late emperor, she stood between the old regime and the new order, a fault line Lü Taihu would brook no compromise upon. Yet even in that bleak hour, Ai Ci clung to a fragment of dignity. As the litter moved, she raised her chin, her breath ragged but steady. Those who watched saw a flicker of pride, a final assertion that she was more than a condemned woman. She was the vestige of a better reign. But beneath that resolve lay a trembling uncertainty. For every tortured soul that had come before her, for every whispered plea, lost in the vastness of Changling's marble halls, Ai Ci now stood on the precipice of a torment so profound that history itself would record it as one of the darkest chapters of the Han Dynasty. The imperial guards flanked her, their armor clinking like distant thunder. Lanterns cast grotesque shadows on the courtyard's stone floor, where later that night, Ai Ci would be thrust into a nightmare beyond imagining. Even as the heavy doors of the inner palace closed behind her, sealing off the world, she once knew her final question echoed silently. How could mercy exist in a world ruled by vengeance? And so within the shivering stillness of Changling Palace, the stage was set. Under the cold gaze of Lü Taihu, Concubine Ai Ci's fate would unfold not simply as an act of reprisal, but as a grim warning to all who dared remember the fallen emperor. Concubine Ai Ci's world had grown smaller than the carved ivory box that once held her jewelry. Her every breath seemed borrowed, as though the very air of Changling Palace had turned to ice. From the moment of her arrest, her body had become a canvas upon which Lü Taihu painted her rage in strokes that left no room for mercy. At first, it was rumors whispered in dimly lit corridors that Ai Ci had fallen gravely ill, that her skin had grown sallow and translucent, as if her life's blood were slipping through an invisible sieve. Those close to the Empress Dowager spoke of a mysterious ailment afflicting Ai Ci, an illness they claimed was divine retribution for her alleged crimes. Yet in truth, the cause of her suffering lay not in the heavens, but in the meticulously orchestrated cruelty of a ruler determined to crush her rival. In the weeks following her incarceration, Ai Ci's health deteriorated at an alarming pace. Once slender and graceful, she weakened into a gaunt silhouette, so fragile that a single breath could have toppled her when she stood. She was kept in a small chamber, deep beneath the palace, its stone walls cold to the touch and damp with unspoken horrors. They brought her scant rations, thin porridge that did little to stave off the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. Often she mistook the rattling chains of nearby prisoners for her own. At night, the air filled with desperate moans that seemed to seep into her very bones. The dampness gave rise to a persistent fever that flickered across her skin, leaving her shivering under the rough hemp blankets they tossed at her. Beyond the physical torment lay the unrelenting psychological assault. Lü Taihu's agents saw to it that Ai Ci was never allowed a full night's sleep. Soldiers burst into her chamber at odd hours to hurl accusations, their voices echoing off the walls, as if to remind her that the empire itself had turned against her. They proclaimed her a poisoner of the late emperor's spirit, a conspirator who had spread dissent among the court. Each waking moment was filled with questions whose answers were irrelevant. Each denial she uttered was met with scoffs or fresh threats. Gradually, the edges of Ai Ci's mind, once sharp and lucid, began to blur. She would catch glimpses of shadows moving in the corridors and convince herself they were loyalists come to set her free, only to realize they were merely guards sent by Lü Taihu to gloat over her despair. The political currents swirling around Ai Ci were no less merciless. As Han Gaozu's widow, Lü Taihu, had seized power through a cunning alliance with key ministers. Under her regency, every noble and scholar courted her favor, many performing public displays of loyalty by denouncing anyone tied to the previous emperor. Ai Ci, once celebrated for her compassion toward famine-stricken regions, now found her past benevolence reinterpreted as an act of subterfuge charity that had built secret networks of opposition. Her charitable shipments of grain, which had saved thousands of peasants in the border provinces, were recast as a scheme to arm rebels against Lü Taihu's rule. The old alliances she had forged with loyalist ministers were reconstructed into evidence of her leading a hidden cabal. In effect, every act of kindness she had ever performed was twisted into a pretext for her downfall. Within the palace, factional infighting intensified as Lü Taihu consolidated her dominance. Loyalists to the late emperor, those who once spoke fondly of Ai Ci's counsel, now kept their faces turned downward, uttering nothing more than perfunctory pledges to the regent. They feared that one misstep could invite the same fate as Ai Ci's. The corridors of power, once echoing with philosophical debate and scholarly counsel, now reeked of suspicion. Meetings were held behind locked doors, where ministers exchanged furtive glances, wondering who would be next. Each report delivered to Lü Taihu no doubt contained veiled praise of her magnanimity, followed by praise for her justice in punishing those who dared contrast her reign with the late emperor's. In these carefully curated reports, Ai Ci's torment was lauded as a necessary purge, a cleansing fire to illuminate the unchallenged authority of the new regent. All the while, Ai Ci's physical agony continued to deepen. The tortures imposed upon her were both ingenious and merciless. At first, she was forced to endure branding hot iron seared across her skin, leaving angry ridges that ached long after the flames subsided. Each branding session was announced by the resounding clang of iron gates, and Ai Ci learned to anticipate the searing pain by the way her jailers paused at her door, their boots clicking in a ritual that spelled doom. Soon her limbs grew cramped from being bound for days on end, her muscles stiffening like brittle ivory. They deprived her of fresh water, substituting it with foul brew laced with bitter herbs that made her stomach churn and her mind reel. In these darkest hours, Ai Ci's mind fractured into shards of memory and dread. She recalled the scent of jasmine when she had first entered the palace, how the petals had fallen like soft snow as she knelt before Han Gaozu, her heart brimming with gratitude. Now the air tasted of rot and rust. In her delirium, she imagined the jade figurines of the imperial garden, whispering that she had betrayed them, that she would never feel the warmth of the sun again. The guards took perverse pleasure in forcing her to repeat false confessions, making her swear that she had conspired to poison the emperor, that she had plotted to install a puppet ruler from a rival state. Each time she refused, they returned with fresh implements of torture, ripping her fingernails, dunking her head into freezing water until her lungs burned, or twisting her ankles into unnatural angles until she lost consciousness. And yet there were moments when something flickered behind Ai Ci's clouded eyes. The memory of her own resolve and compassion. When her body could no longer stand, her spirit summoned memories of the long evenings she had spent listening to the woes of farmers, of the children she had fed from her own stores. In those fleeting moments of clarity, she dared to believe that perhaps this agony would not last. But Lü Taihu seemed determined to extinguish even the faintest ember of hope. The regent's agents visited their faces cold as frost to deliver whispered ultimatums the torment would end only when Ai Ci confessed to crimes imagined by her accusers. And so, every flicker of hope was snuffed out by fresh waves of cruelty. In the heart of Changling Palace, the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Word of Ai Ci's suffering spread through the scholarly academies and rural villages alike. Secret letters traveled under guards' noses, carried by loyalists who still remembered her kindness. Farmers in distant provinces whispered prayers for her escape. Scholars debated in hushed tones whether to rise up or remain silent. Yet fear held many captive. The knowledge that Lü Taihu would spare no one who defied her despotism created a pall that stretched across the empire. Even those in the palace who longed for a return to Han Gaozu's just rule felt powerless. Meanwhile, within her dank chamber, Ai Ci stared at the cracked ceiling, her body a battlefield where pain raged like an endless storm. Day by day, her bones grew more brittle. Every movement sent blinding stabs of agony through her limbs. Language itself seemed hollow. She no longer knew why she had fought so fiercely for the empire's welfare, why she had devoted herself to easing others' suffering. In the solitude of her despair, she felt the enormity of her situation. If she survived, she might never possess the strength to reclaim her former life. If she died, her memory might vanish like smoke in the wind. Yet somewhere buried beneath her anguish, a flicker of defiance remained. A single thought sustained her, that Lü Taihu's iron grip on the throne would not go unchallenged forever. As guards approached her chamber to drag her once more into unspeakable torments, Ai Ci summoned what remained of her will, steeling herself against the rising tide of pain. Outside the wheels of political conspiracy, continued to turn. Lü Taihu's allies praised her merciful clemency, even as they tightened the noose around dissenters. Every public proclamation celebrated the Empress Dowager's wisdom, while the emperor's loyalists fell into suspicion or vanished without a trace. Ai Ci's ordeal had become both a warning and a rallying cry. Anyone who remembered Han Gaozu's reign risked facing the same fate. The tension in the court grew palpable. Ministers no longer spoke freely, and even the palace ladies exchanged glances heavy with dread, knowing that their own innocence offered little shield against Lü Taihu's paranoia. Yet for all the outward displays of loyalty to the regent, there were whispers that Lü Taihu's enemies were gathering strength beyond the palace gates. Rural communities, long grateful for Ai Ci's charitable efforts, began sending surreptitious offerings to officials who might be inclined to rise in rebellion. A few courageous scholars drafted treatises denouncing the Empress Dowager's tyranny, though their words were circulated in code, hidden among texts on poetry or agriculture. These clandestine acts of defiance grew bolder as word of Ai Ci's continued suffering spread. It became clear that while Lü Taihu could command the palace, she could not extinguish every spark of dissent in the empire's far-flung provinces. And so, as Ai Ci lay broken in her cell, she existed at the center of forces both deadly and invisible. Each strained breath she took was a testament to her endurance. Each wave of pain a reminder of Lü Taihu's merciless will. The empire watched in fearful fascination as her physical form crumbled under the weight of political vengeance. Yet within that collapse lay the seeds of future conflict, a struggle between those who revered the memory of Han Gaozu's benevolent reign and those who served Lü Taihu's iron-handed rule. In the shrouded darkness of the palace dungeon, Ai Ci's battered spirit whispered defiance to the silent stones, knowing that her ordeal had become more than her own. It was a mirror reflecting the empire's brittle soul. The first rays of dawn filtered through the narrow slits of Ai Ci's cell painting, pale stripes across her emaciated frame. Yet these gentle beams brought no comfort. They only illuminated the hollows beneath her eyes and the raw, angry scars that mapped her torso. In that moment, Ai Ci felt as though her very existence had been reduced to darkness and light, two forces vying for control over a body and spirit that were nearly spent. She did not know how many days had passed since the last torment. Time had become as fluid as her fevered dreams. But on this morning, a new dread settled in her bones, the promise of yet another trial designed to crush what little remained of her will. Soldiers arrived soon after sunrise, their footsteps echoing down the cold corridor. Ai Ci recognized them by the way their armor rang sharply, the sound like unwelcome bells heralding her doom. They thrust her to her knees on the damp stone floor, and when she dared to raise her head, she saw Lü Taihu's pale face, framed by heavy silks, emotionless as a statue carved from marble. For a moment the world seemed to contract, until only the two of them remained, the fallen concubine, and the widow now seated upon the seat of power, a silent observer to her suffering. "No more ruses, Ai Ci Lü Taihu," intoned her voice cold as frost. "Admit your treachery, and you may yet have a chance at mercy." Ai Ci's response was a ragged whisper. "I swore loyalty to Han Gaozu and to this dynasty. I have done nothing but serve." Lü Taihu's lips curved into a faint predatory smile. "Your service was nothing but a masquerade. You poisoned my husband's mind. You bewitched him with flattery. Now confess or face the consequences of your lies." At that, the soldiers seized Ai Ci's arms and lifted her, her legs convulsing with the effort of standing. She felt each footstep as a hammer blow to her battered limbs. The air around her quivered with tension, the tension of a puppet dragged to its final performance. She shivered not from cold, but from the knowledge that each breath brought her closer to an abyss too vast to imagine. They led her through a series of corridors, each lined with grotesque sculptures meant to remind traitors of their fate, iron statues of criminals writhing in eternal torment, stone reliefs dripping with symbolic gore. When Ai Ci finally emerged into the courtyard, the early light revealed a contraption erected at its center, a large wooden frame from which iron chains dangled like the fingers of a malevolent deity. Several guards stood nearby, their eyes unreadable, as if they awaited Lü Taihu's command, rather than offering any compassion to the woman shackled before them. As Ai Ci was bound to the frame, she felt the cold bite of iron around her wrists and ankles, a familiar agony that had become the punctuation of her existence. The courtyard was silent, save for the quiet hum of the dawn breeze, a cruel contrast to the roars of violence that would soon fill the space. Lü Taihu took her place on a raised platform, nearby, flanked by ministers and attendants, who watched with hawk-like intensity. Even the pigeons roosting on the palace roof fell silent, as though they sensed the coming storm. The first blow fell like thunder on Ai Ci's shoulder, delivered by a tall executioner, whose face was carved into a permanent scowl. Metal struck flesh with a sickening thud, and Ai Ci bit back a scream that would have alerted Lü Taihu to any weakness. The iron cudgel crashed a second time, and pain exploded across her torso. Her vision swam, but she clenched her teeth, refusing to give the regent the satisfaction of hearing her cry out. Instead, she stared straight ahead, her gaze finding the distant mountains that cradled the capital, a silent witness to the empire's rise and fall. "You still cling to lies," Lü Taihu declared, her voice carrying easily across the courtyard. "Confess that you sought to poison the late emperor's mind. Confess that you plotted with foreign powers. Confess, or I will break every bone in your body until you beg for death." Ai Ci's lips trembled, but her eyes remained steady. "I swore to serve the empire. I loved the emperor with all my heart. I would never betray him." Her words seemed to amuse Lü Taihu. The executioner raised his cudgel again, this time striking Ai Ci's side. She convulsed her body, twisting against the iron chains until her ribs felt as though they would splinter. A gasp escaped her lips, not from fear, but from a pain so acute that the world throbbed with each heartbeat. The courtyard echoed with the dull percussion of iron on flesh, a brutal symphony, orchestrated by the regent's unyielding hand. As the blows persisted, Ai Ci's mind drifted back to a memory of Han Gaozu, standing beneath the blossoming plum trees, his hand resting gently on hers, as she described a modest donation to feed the starving villagers in the north. She remembered the warmth in his eyes, the grateful tears of the peasants when their tummies were finally filled. Those moments felt like another lifetime, one when she moved through the world with purpose and hope rather than fear and agony. Each punishing strike forced her back into the present, into the realization that the empire she had once served so devotedly now regarded her as a threat to its very existence. She wondered briefly if any of her former allies watched from within the shaded corridors, their eyes unmoved by her torment. Had they fled, or were they complicit in her downfall? The question panged at her heart, for she had believed that loyalty could withstand the crucible of power. Now she began to doubt even that. Suddenly, a shrill cry cut through the air, louder than the clang of metal, the alarm that an outsider had breached the palace defenses. Soldiers gasped, and Lü Taihu's imperious expression flickered for the first time, with something like concern. For a heartbeat, the courtyard froze. Ai Ci's head lulled the world spinning as the executioner readied another blow. In that suspended moment, a contingent of horsemen thundered through the main gates. Their armor flashed like cold fire in the morning light. A hush fell over the assembled courtiers as the riders rode toward Ai Ci's frame. At their helm was a man in scholarly robes, his once youthful face now lined with age and grief, the teaching seals of the academy hanging from his neck. He spurred his steed forward, voice ringing out like a command that brooked no denial. Empress Dowager Lü, release her at once. By imperial edict and the will of the late emperor to minister Yan Shi, demand her freedom, the courtyard erupted into chaos. Guards hesitated, unsure whether to protect Lu Taihu's edict or honor the minister's challenge. Lu Taihu's lips curled with disdain as she stepped forward. "Minister Yan Shi," she said coolly, "you present a forged decree. Who gave you this authority?" Yan Shi drew a folded scroll from within his robes, holding it aloft. The seal bore the dragon emblem of Han Gaozu himself. This dowager was hidden in the imperial archives, overlooked until last night. It names Ai Ci as a guardian of the young emperor's virtue, tasks her with ensuring his moral education. By the late emperor's decree, she is under his protection. Your orders contravene his final wishes. Gasps rang out among the onlookers. Ai Ci's eyes widened, and she felt the iron chains slacken as soldiers exchanged uncertain glances. Lu Taihu took a step back, her facade of calm imperceptibly cracking. No one in the courtyard had seen the emperor's final commands. They existed only in the hidden chamber known to a select few. To challenge Lu Taihu with such a revelation was to question her very legitimacy. For a heartbeat, Lu Taihu's gaze flickered toward Ai Ci's bloodied form. Her lips twisted in a semblance of sorrow, or was it regret? Yet the hardness glinted behind her eyes. Even this moment of hesitation was calculated. The aged minister would deceive us with lies, she declared, voice steeled. That scroll is a forgery, conjured by those who wish to plunge the empire into chaos. Arrest him for treason. At her words, guards lunged for Yan Shi, but he stepped aside, deftly, knocking an officer's sword loose from its scabbard. With a roar, Yan Shi raised his voice above the clamor. See for yourselves. He strode toward Ai Ci, tears mingling with sweat on his brow. Look upon the woman you claim is a traitor. Is this how the late emperor's loyal guardian should be treated? At the same time, a group of palace eunuchs emerged from the eastern corridors, brandishing torches and degrees of the imperial seal, their faces determined. They had smuggled the genuine document forth under cover of darkness. Behind them marched a silent squad of royal guards, long loyal to the late emperor. The tension in the courtyard had become taut as a bowstring. Any misstep could trigger a bloodbath. Lu Taihu's eyes darted frantically among the assembled witnesses. To maintain her iron rule, she needed to quash this challenge decisively. Quietly, she nodded to the chief executioner. He obeyed instantly and raised his cudgel once more. Ai Ci braced herself. Her body slumped, but not entirely defeated. The courtyard held its collective breath as the iron weapon came down in an arc. But before the blast of bone-shattering force could land, a thunderous crack echoed overhead. A contingent of guards commanded by a young general burst into the courtyard from the southern flank, swords drawn. He wore the livery of Han Gaozu's personal guard, an azuric dragon embroidered on his breastplate. Stop, he bellowed. By imperial right, I place the Empress Dowager under arrest for violation of the Emperor's last will. At the sound of this voice, Ai Ci's vision blurred, not from pain, but from shock. Multiple factions, once presumed loyal to Lu Taihu, now swung into action. Some guards lowered their weapons, while others faced off with hardened stares. Court ladies trembled, and ministers watched in stunned silence as the symmetry of power cracked in live spectacle. In that suspended moment, Ai Ci realized that the tide had turned, however briefly. The man who had led the charge was General Li Xian, a commander of unwavering loyalty to Han Gaozu, and a warrior whose fearsome reputation once subdued border brigands. Now he strode forward, his dark eyes fixed on Lu Taihu. You have seized power through deceit and blood, he proclaimed. By the late emperor's mandate, your regency is ended. Surrender, or face the judgment of the court. Lü Taihu's face drained of color, yet she refused to bow. Her voice faltered only a moment before she spat, "Traitorous rabble, you dare defy the Empress Dowager." With a swift gesture, she signaled hidden archers perched atop the palace walls. Arrows whistled through the air, threatening to ignite a massacre. As the first shafts slammed into the courtyard's stone, Ai Ci felt her chest tighten, not from physical pain, but from the realization that the moment of salvation was fraught with peril. Loyalist and regent forces clashed in a thunderous uproar. Shield splintered steel, rang against steel, and cries of defiance echoed. Through the chaos, General Li Xian fought his way toward Ai Ci's frame, shielding her form with his body. He stood over her, brandishing his sword to deflect any further blows from the executioner. And so, in that calamitous clash of regimes, Ai Ci's battered form became the epicenter of a crisis that would decide the empire's fate. Around her, the courtyard erupted in violence, setting ablaze the hopes and fears of all who watched. The chains that bound her rattled as though seeking freedom, while Lü Taihu's fury cut through the tumult like a blade. In that charged moment, horizons blurred the spinning wheels of political conspiracy, the thunderous echoes of clashing steel, and the blood that stained stone. Each element coalesced into a single fiery crescendo. As the archers' arrows fell harmless around them, mooing past Li Xian's raised shield, Ai Ci's mind trembled between life and death. If the loyalists succeeded, she would be saved, and her sworn innocence vindicated. But if her rescuers faltered, she would become dust beneath the boot heel of vengeance. In the maelstrom, the final outcome remained a question suspended between hope and oblivion. The reign of Lü Taihu, once unchallenged, now found itself teetering as her subjects turned the tide in defense of a concubine who had until her last breath refused to sacrifice her honor. And as the first light of morning broke in earnest, illuminating the swirling banners and blood-soaked stone, the next chapter of Ai Ci's fate, her final ordeal and possible deliverance, hung perilously unresolved at the heart of a courtyard, transformed into a battlefield of dynastic justice. The clang of swords and the shouts of soldiers echoed like thunder across the courtyard as Ai Ci's battered form hung suspended between life and death. In the chaos, General Li Xian fought back wave after wave of Lü Taihu's guards, each steel-clad assailant swept aside by his practiced blade. Yet even as loyalist reinforcements surged, the courtyard remained a furnace of violence, arrows raining down from hidden archers' shields, splintering against relentless blows, and the scent of dust mingling with blood. Through the turmoil, Ai Ci's eyes fluttered awareness, eclipsed by the searing pain in her side and the lingering pallor of her skin. Her lungs burned each breath a ragged gasp, but a faint ember of hope flickered within her as Li Xian's shield loomed above her. He knelt by her side, pressing a cloth to her bloodied ribs, whispering, "Hold on, my lady. I will not let them take you." His voice trembled with urgency, but in that moment, Ai Ci grasped his hand, drawing solace from his presence. She forced her eyelids open, meeting his gaze, and saw both desperation and determination mirrored in his dark eyes. Above them, Lü Taihu's figure loomed like a specter of authority. Her eyes burned with fury and disbelief, as though every ounce of her carefully cultivated dominion were slipping through her fingers. "Seize them," she hissed, raising her arm toward the loyalists. But in that instant, a shout rose from the western gate. More loyalist troops bearing the imperial banner poured into the courtyard with resonant war cries. They cut a path through the remaining regent soldiers, their disciplined ranks advancing like a tidal wave. The tide had turned unmistakably against Lü Taihu. Realizing her position had become untenable, Lü Taihu's composure fractured. With a sharp gesture, she signaled a retreat behind the palace gates, and her guards reluctantly obeyed, dragging the wounded among them. Li Xian rose his sword, lowered but still gripped in readiness, and turned to face the concubine. He inhaled deeply, covering her wounds with whatever remained of his cloak. "Ai Ci," he said softly, "we must get you to safety before she regroups." Ai Ci's vision swam as he lifted her from the iron frame, every movement wrenching pain from her fractured ribs. Yet beneath the agony lay a profound relief. The cruel orchestration of Lu Taihu's vengeance seemed broken, if only for a fleeting moment. As Li Xian placed her upon a waiting litter, the echoes of battle faded behind them, replaced by the quiet toll of alarm bells, signaling the overthrow of the Empress Dowager's rule. They carried Ai Ci through winding corridors, past stunned courtiers who dared not meet her gaze, and into the inner chambers, where the young emperor, barely a boy, no older than 10, sat pale and trembling upon his throne. He had watched the unfolding duel from a side balcony, uncertainty and terror etched across his features. When his eyes fell upon Ai Ci's bloodied form, a shudder ran through him, and he leapt from his seat. "Mother," he whispered, confusion lacing his voice. Ai Ci's breath hitched as she tried to speak, but the weight of her injuries pinned her tongue. The boy rushed to her side, reaching out to steady her. "Concubine Ai Ci," he murmured, his voice quavering. "Are you well? Did they harm you?" His innocence shattered her remaining defenses, and tears welled behind her pain-clouded eyes. For an instant, she saw the world she had once served, a place where compassion had ruled, and suffering could be eased. That world now felt distant, like a dream slipping through her grasp. General Li Xian knelt beside her and spoke quietly to the boy in measured tones. "Your Majesty Ai Ci's life was in grave danger. I beseech you to let me tend to her wounds so that she may recover." The emperor nodded his small figure, trembling with unspoken grief. He turned his gaze to the assembled ministers, whose faces were pale beneath the flickering torchlight. Each understood the gravity of this moment. Ai Ci was not merely a fallen concubine. She embodied the inheritance of Han Gaozu's legacy. Amid this fragile calm, the elder minister Yan Shi approached the throne. His robes were stained with soot and sweat, his hair disheveled from the morning's turmoil. He bowed deeply to the young emperor, then turned to Ai Ci. "Your Majesty entrusted Ai Ci with the welfare of the empire," he intoned, his voice quivering. "She has served you faithfully. By the late emperor's will, she deserves protection, not punishment. Let her be cared for in the Eastern Pavilion until her strength returns." The emperor's eyes lingered on Ai Ci's face, the bruises, the cuts, the hollow look of someone who had endured unspeakable pain. With a scent that felt like a benediction, he nodded. "Let it be so." Instantly, a wave of relief washed through the ministers, and gentle hands moved to carry Ai Ci toward the pavilion. As they passed through the carved wooden doors, a hush fell over the throne room, a stark contrast to the storm that had raged only moments before. Within the eastern pavilion, silence reigned. Only the measured drip of water from a porcelain ewer interrupted the stillness. Healers and attendants bustled to prepare clean bandages and herbal salves. The sweet aroma of medicinal ointments mingled with the faint stench of blood, creating a scent that echoed both healing and sorrow. Li Xian lowered Ai Ci onto a cushioned bed, his movements tender, despite the lingering tension in his muscles. He removed her tattered garments, revealing deep welts and lacerations that seemed to weave a tapestry of her suffering. Even under his respectful ministrations, her body trembled under the cold touch of air. A healer's hand hovered over her chest, feeling each shallow breath, then began to clean the wounds with a cloth soaked in warm, scented water. Ai Ci closed her eyes, focusing on the sensation of gentle pressure rather than the lancinating sting of cleansed wounds. She thought of the courtiers who had watched her torment with complacency, of Lu Taihu's icy whispers that had threatened her very essence. Now, here in this small chamber, she felt vulnerability in its rawest form. Life teetered between fragile survival and an abyss from which no return seemed possible. As night began its slow descent beyond the pavilion's lattice windows, a hush enveloped the courtyard outside. Echoes of battle had transformed into whispered prayers and hushed conversations. The empire, though still reeling, sensed an irreversible shift. Lü Taihu had been captured and was being escorted to the northern dungeons where traitors awaited their judgment. The young emperor would assume full authority in his own name, guided by ministers who vowed to restore the compassionate governance of his father. Yet none of these solemn vows could erase the scars, both visible and invisible, that Ai Ci now carried. Hours passed under flickering oil lamps as the healer tended to her broken body, resetting fractured bones, binding cuts with healing salves, and whispering incantations to ward off infection. By the time dawn's first light crept through the windows, Ai Ci drifted into a fitful sleep, her chest rising and falling in shallow rhythms. In her dreams she wandered through fields of blooming plum trees, the petals falling like snow as she stood beside the late emperor, his hand warm around hers. The memory felt both distant and achingly real, a place where mercy and purpose still prevailed. But with each heartbeat, that dream seemed to slip further away. When she awoke, weak rays of sunlight revealed a chamber suffused with pale gold light. Li Xian sat vigil at her side, his armor set aside, and his expression etched with exhaustion and relief. He brushed her hair from her forehead, gently placing a cool cloth against her brow. "You are safe now," he whispered. "The regent has been deposed. The empire stands ready to honor your service." Ai Ci's lips parted, and she tried to speak, but her voice emerged as a fragile whisper. "Dead," she croaked the single word, loaded with grief and disbelief. Li Xian's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Lord Emperor has begun his reign in earnest," he replied softly. "Lü Taihu has indeed perished, condemned to the ultimate punishment for her treachery." A shudder racked Ai Ci as the finality of those words sank in. The widow who had wrought such suffering was gone, but in her place stood an emperor, burdened by loss, and a court scarred by violence. Ai Ci felt the weight of her own broken body, the hollowness in her stomach, and the fragments of memory that threatened to shatter her resolve. She wondered if the world she had once known, one of justice and hope, could ever return. Yet beneath the physical agony, a flicker of resolve remained. Perhaps in surviving this crucible, she could help shape the empire's future. The chamber door opened quietly, and the young emperor entered, his face pale but determined. He knelt beside her bed, hands folded respectfully. "Concubine Ai Ci," he said, his voice steady, yet tender. "You have suffered beyond measure. The empire owes you a debt that cannot be repaid. Rest now, for when you are well, I will call upon your counsel." Tears glistened in Ai Ci's eyes as she reached out a trembling hand. The emperor took it, and for a moment the ravages of torture seemed to melt before the raw sincerity in his gaze. She felt the fragile scaffolding of her body hold for a single instant, buoyed by this final act of trust. Thus Ai Ci's life, once teetering on the edge of oblivion, slanted toward a tragic conclusion, not of death, but of profound transformation. The iron chains had been removed, but the invisible scars etched upon her heart would remain. In the hush of that morning chamber, the empire began to stir under a new dawn, one that might yet learn from the wreckage of cruelty. And as she closed her eyes once more, drifting into uneasy rest, a single truth echoed in her mind. Power unchecked and vengeful could shatter even the strongest spirit. Yet survival, however painful, carried with it the potential for mercy and healing. In the days to come, Ai Ci would stand as a living testament to both the depths of human cruelty and the possibility of redemption. In the weeks that followed Ai Ci's near-fatal ordeal, The halls of Changling Palace resonated with cautious whispers. The empire had cast off the shadow of Lü Taihu's tyranny, but the reverberations of her cruelty lingered long after the echoes of swords had faded. Concubine Ai Ci, once an instrument of imperial compassion, now found her role reshaped by suffering and survival. Though her body still trembled with the memory of iron chains and searing blows, her spirit had hardened into something both fragile and unbreakable, a living testament to the resilience of those who endure injustice. News of Ai Ci's survival spread through every corner of the realm. In distant provinces, where starving peasants once remembered her as the benevolent hand that sent grain during famine, villagers erected small memorials and offered silent prayers for her recovery. Scholar gentry circles that had once debated in hushed tones about Lü Taihu's legitimacy now proclaimed Ai Ci as a beacon of loyalty to Han Gaozu's principles. Hidden treatises circulated lauding her charity and lamenting the empire's near collapse under reckless vengeance. The very causes for which Ai Ci had risked everything compassion, duty, and selfless service became rallying cries for a broader movement to restore benevolent governance. Within the palace itself, the new emperor consulted Ai Ci, cautiously respecting both her wisdom and her wounds. In council chambers lined with jade and silk ministers deferred to her suggestions on famine relief and legal reform. Her voice, once faint and tremulous, grew steadier with each meeting, as though her body's healing spoke to the empire's own rebuilding. She urged the emperor to codify protections for those accused without proof, to ensure that no subject could again be punished by rumor or spite. The emperor, humbled by her suffering and guided by her counsel, enacted decrees that restored lands wrongfully seized and provided relief for imprisoned families of those who had been labeled dissidents. These measures, though modest, symbolized a profound shift from fear-based rule to a system that, at least in aspiration, valued justice. Yet Ai Ci's personal journey remained fraught. The once graceful concubine now moved with deliberate caution, her ribs forever aching from fractures that had never fully mended. Each night she found herself haunted by flashes of that suffocating cell, the cold iron against her flesh, and Lü Taihu's final contemptuous gaze. No balm of healing salve or ceremonial bath could wash away these specters. In quiet moments she gazed upon the jade figurine presented to her by the late emperor, a token of his regard for her kindness, and wondered how kindness could survive in a world capable of such cruelty. It was in those moments that she grasped the empire's greatest lesson: authority, entrusted to those who forget. Mercy becomes a tormentor rather than a steward. As for Lü Taihu, her name became synonymous with the perils of unbridled power. Executed in a ceremony that balanced ritual decorum with undeniable severity, her death served as a stark warning. No one, not even an Empress Dowager, was above the empire's moral conscience. In historical annals compiled under the emperor's direct supervision, her reign was recorded as a cautionary tale, a chapter written in crimson ink indelible in its warning against cruelty. Sometimes courtiers spoke of her final moments in hushed reverence. Other times, they used her downfall as a guise to press for further reform. But always her legacy reminded every subject that unchecked vengeance corrodes the foundation of trust between ruler and people. In the broader tapestry of Han Dynasty history, Ai Ci's story became a poignant thread, one that wove together power, vulnerability, and redemption. Poets composed elegiac verses, mourning her suffering and celebrating her return to influence. Painters sketched her likeness in delicate ink, capturing both her frailty and her stoic endurance. In ritual ceremonies commemorating past emperors, a place of honor was reserved for Ai Ci's name, acknowledging her role in preserving the dynasty's integrity. Even foreign envoys learned of her tale, remarking that the Han court's capacity for both barbarity and compassion offered a sobering lesson in the complexities of rule. Ultimately, Ai Ci's legacy transcended the particulars of her torment. She embodied the fragile equilibrium between mercy and power, demonstrating that true authority demands more than fear. It requires empathy, accountability, and the willingness to heal. In advising the young emperor, she shaped policies that balanced justice with compassion, giving renewed hope to those who had suffered under tyranny. Yet she never forgot that her voice had once been silenced under iron chains, that history's quill had nearly ended her story before it could fulfill its purpose. In the lingering dusk of her final years, Ai Ci retreated occasionally to the palace garden, beneath the same plum trees where she had once stood with Han Gaozu. Petals fell like snow, and in their quiet descent she saw an echo of life's impermanence. She touched a blossom, recalling her laughter and the promise of service that had once illuminated her path. Then, with a measured breath, she straightened, aware that though her body bore scars, her spirit had become a bridge between past cruelty and future compassion. Thus the empire remembered Concubine Ai Ci not merely as a victim of unthinkable torture, but as a living emblem of endurance and moral clarity. Her message endured. When power forgets mercy, it invites its own undoing. When individuals endure injustice with empathy and tact, they hold the promise of renewal. And so in the annals of China's history, Ai Ci's story stands as both a somber warning and a stirring inspiration, testament to the indomitable strength of the human spirit, and the hope that even after the darkest night, a new dawn can rise.